souls share in the Argentinian company. You know, you play with fire, you get burned. And that's my interesting news note of the day. And now I have the pleasure of having here with me, as I mentioned, one of the smartest and wittiest members of Congress, Congressman Thad McCotter from Michigan, he's been in Congress since 2003, was twice elected by his colleagues to serve as chairman of the Republican House Policy Committee, is the author of Seize Freedom, American Truths and Renewal in a Chaotic Age, a book that examines the great parallels between the challenges confronted and conquered by the greatest generation and those of the global generation, and is also an accomplished musician and band leader of previously the Second Amendment. Does the band still exist, Congressman?
Sadly, yes.
It still
exists.
It still exists. Well, having heard it before, I would not say sadly. I think it's a very accomplished group. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Mauricio.
You know, I want to find out what is the difference. What is you mentioned the greatest generation and the global generation. What is the difference between these?
Well, the parallels are striking, and there is one critical difference. Obviously, the greatest generation, aptly named, confronted tremendous challenges throughout the course of their lives. The greatest generation faced a horrific depression. They faced a world war against evil enemies. They faced the rise of the Soviet Union as a strategic threat and rival model of governance. And they faced the moral question of whether or not the Constitution of the United States applied equally to all citizens. When you look at what our global generation of Americans is facing, we're facing a continually stagnant, recessed economy. We're facing a world war against evil enemies. We are facing the rise of Communist China as a strategic threat, rival model of governance. And we are facing the moral question whether or not a nation built upon self-evident truths can survive moral relativism. The critical distinction, Mauricio, is that where the greatest generation faced their crises consecutively, our global generation faces our challenges concurrently.
One of the big issues that you've always dealt with has been China, and obviously I think that this is one of the greatly underspoken about issues in current foreign policy. You've said that we have to treat the People's Republic of China as a strategic threat and rival model of governance that impairs our security and our prosperity. That's pretty self-evident what it means, but can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think one of the things that you find when you come to Washington is it exacerbates people's ideological myopia. In fact, I've actually had conversations with members of Congress and others who, that when you call the PRC what it is, what they call themselves, Communist China, you will have these members or these other individuals argue with you. Now look, it's what they call themselves. They make no bones about it. They have 74.3 million and counting card-carrying members of the Communist Party. They've had articles about how the Communist Chinese astronauts believe that communism is a way of life that they can't wait to take up into space with them. And if you watch, the regime remains the same. So to me, it's something that most Americans don't like to think about. And as you know, from watching communist regimes in the ash bin of history or those that are still extant, they tend to blame the victim for everything they do, so that when you start to address some of the unfair trade practices, when you address some of the strategic problems that they cause the United States, they will say that we are trying to instigate a new Cold War, when the reality is they never left the Cold War because they remain communist.
Well, and I think that part of the reason is that it makes people feel better not to have to relay it that way or have to call a spade a spade.
Well, it can make them feel better here, but I think it does a great disservice to the Chinese people who suffer
That's right.
in the jails, who suffer torture at the hands of the regime, who are denied their human rights. The Chinese people who wish to go to a church of their choice, who wish to have a Bible, who don't want to have to go through a state administration of religious affairs. People who want to have the God-given rights like everyone else deserves and demands. So to me, the discomfort intellectually that's caused by the recognition that Communist China is, as they themselves call themselves, communist, is small price to pay for the truth of the suffering and to help alleviate it.
This year's the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's trip to China, which now is referred to as bold and that changed the strategic orientation of two superpowers. Do you think that President Nixon himself, I've heard some of his advisors saying that this is not exactly what he envisioned, having created now this huge superpower that at the end of the day we can't criticize because we're concerned our interest rates will somehow be affected, was not what he had in mind. Do you think that what do you think his view would have been?
Well, Nixonian foreign policy, in many ways, essentially Henry Kissinger's policy, realpolitik, they were trying to unsettle the Soviet Union by breaking off, in a strategic sense, Mao's Communist China from what they perceived to be a strained relationship, and rightly so at the time, between Brezhnev's Soviet Union and themselves. So when you look at what Nixon did and what Kissinger thought about doing, it was a very, in my mind, time-specific event with a longer-term strategic goal. Reagan, of course, transcended Kissinger's détente theory with the truth that people want to breathe free in the United States to support movements within captive nations so that their people can break the yoke of communism. What we see now in the present day is people misunderstanding what was attempted by Nixon, not seeing the longer-term strategic context in which, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Communist Chinese in Beijing killed my generation in the streets of Tiananmen Square for quoting Jefferson and Madison, because they understood that they were next, that their own people no longer wanted to be under communist rule. So to have that barbarous regime still in place and to somehow treat it as if it's not communist is, to me, to reward the very acts of murder that were committed against their own people when I was growing up.
You've been one of the most outspoken members of Congress in regards to the persecution of religious groups, to the persecution of pro-democracy movements in China. You've sponsored bills and presented resolutions supporting the Charter 2008 movement, the Charter 08 movement, which is a manifesto in China that was signed by over 300 Chinese intellectuals, including the current last year's Nobel Peace Prize, Liu Xiaobo. You actually did that in 2009, so you preceded the Nobel Committee, which I imagine was a surprise to you as it was to us all that they were courageous enough for once to actually do this in this regards. Do you think that things have changed somewhat since Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize? Has there been more awareness, or are we still playing the same game?
I think it's still, amongst the political class, the same game. I think that what happens is real people ask the question of why a Nobel Prize winner can't leave their own country and accept the award. I think that the longer that the American people have a chance to seriously study what's going on with Communist China, with that regime, and what happens to people that the regime does not like, no matter how much notoriety or how many laurels they get throughout the world, to see that they aren't free to travel, to see that they aren't free to speak their opinions, will one day hasten the day that the American political class has to respond to the people who say, why are you continuing to treat this regime as if it's another freely elected democracy or republic?
You were one of the few Republicans, frankly, that in 2008 were against President Bush attending the Olympic Games. I mean, how much of a monumental failure was that for him to go there? What a hit to the pro-democracy movement was that?
I think it was a horrible mistake, and I said so at the time. This was the first time a United States president had attended an Olympics on foreign soil. And to choose the People's Republic of China struck me as a horrible precedent to set. And ironically, one of the things that I think I recall correctly that happened when the president was there was that Russia invaded the sovereign democracy of Georgia. So Mr. Putin was certainly aware of where the president was.
What do you think? Well, obviously, the Obama administration has not been particularly better in regards to human rights in China. They have recently made some economic measures in order to complain against some of the unfair economic practices of the Chinese government. I mean, this is beginning to be a lost throughout. At first people said, well, look, there's no more political rights and no more human rights in China, after all these years of unconditional engagement in business. But now even in economic terms, it's also a loss. So where is the major win that we're getting from our basically nonchalant policy towards China?
Well, the unconditional appeasement policy does have some winners. There are people who go over there and make a lot of money. There are people who supported the initial Nixon move and subsequent policy changes that have a vested interest in hoping they're proved right over time. But in the end, the truth will set us all free, and most notably the Chinese people, who I believe that once they're free, between our two countries, we will see a great era of peace and prosperity that's unprecedented.
Congressman, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about, you've been one of the leaders in the freedom agenda, the freedom movement throughout the world, not only China, but also in Eastern Europe, Belarus, Latin America. When we come back, I want to talk about some of those other regions. This has been From Washington at Mundo. We'll be back after this short break. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone. Welcome back to From Washington at Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone, and what a pleasure to have with me today here in the studio just one of the smartest members of Congress. And, we were just talking in the...
Well, that's a low bar, Mauricio.
Well,
thanks.
far from. We were just talking during the break about, unfortunately, people don't seem to be interested enough on foreign policy anymore. And that's one of the things that we definitely wanted to do here on Christina Radio, on Sirius XM, that we wanted to do in the show, focus on foreign policy, because there are issues, particularly in this new, interactive world where everything's in real time, they all affect us. And at the end of the day, if we don't speak out in particular for the human rights abuses against these dictatorships throughout the world, then China would be the leader. And wouldn't that be a different world per se?
Well, yes, it would. And as you noted, people, real, working, hard, working, normal people, have a very strong desire to hear about what's going on in the world. They understand that while the mainstream media may not report it or cable networks may not, the reality is that when you can sit at your laptop, hit a stroke of a key, and purchase a good from somewhere around the world, or where you can go on Facebook and talk to friends that are tens, thousands of miles away, they know that the world's getting even smaller because of the global communications revolution. So they want to know what's going on. And obviously Americans are very, very concerned that other people get their God-given rights to liberty that we have. We touched on it earlier, and I just want to add to the Communist China discussion because it's relevant to this, is when you talk about, well, are we going to let Communist China be the country of the future? My argument would be no. Because as Americans, we understand it's a rival model of governance. In the United States, we believe that all our rights are God-given. They do not come from the government, they come from God. From there, you inevitably proceed to limited government, toward a republic, whereby there are things the government simply cannot do to you. They're your servants, not your masters. When you start from the Communist Chinese perspective, that all your rights come from the government, which is absolutely subordinate to a party, which calls itself a vanguard of the proletariat, you can see you are heading towards oppression. You are heading towards a government that believes you are the servant and it is the master. So to me, knowing about foreign affairs, knowing about how certain countries, especially those who don't recognize the sovereignty of the individual over their government, is very important to Americans.
And unfortunately, sometimes when Americans say, and we say, why are we so worried about what's happening halfway around the world? And then people that support the Ron Paul view of the world, if we would have not had the approach, and the confrontational approach, frankly, with the Soviet Union, and let's say the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War, it would have been a different world. And if today we sit back nonchalantly with China, I'm not saying that China is going to beat us, because it's just not going to happen. But it would not be. It would be. Thank God that America is the leader in the world, and thank God that the values that we have are what are being projected throughout the world, because it would be a very different world otherwise.
I think you're right. The United States has proven to be a premier force for moral good in the world. The exceptions where we've lapsed actually prove that rule. And when we talk about Communist China and others, I think you're absolutely right. I don't want anybody to get the sense that I believe or you believe or anyone should that Communist China is going to be the leading country in the 21st century. Communism is antithetical to human nature. It is a stultifying, oppressive environment. It will never allow for the entrepreneurship, the creativity, the freedom to be a premier nation in the world. It's never going to happen. The question that I have is whether or not the United States, in the eyes of the Chinese people who are suffering, is going to be the United States abetted our oppressors, or did the United States, as Ronald Reagan and the country did in the 1980s, did we abet freedom?
And at the end of the day, also two fundamental issues with which China will not succeed. Obviously, if you don't have a rule of law, your economic system is always going to be flawed. And now what we can do, which would be unfortunate, is prolong the existence of these regimes. And for a generation or so, you mentioned Tiananmen Square. If the world would have stood up in 1991 against what was happening in Tiananmen Square, against all those young people, which wasn't one day and a few hundred. No, it was months of activity and thousands, tens of thousands of young people. If the world would have stood up and said, this is unacceptable, China was still it still is a developing, but it was a way developing economy. It was not by far now the economic powerhouse that the United States has helped it become. It would have put them in a very tough situation. But the blind eye that the world turned towards that generation prolonged this regime for another generation. And that's why we got to make sure not to do so again currently.
You're absolutely right. And it's if the EU hadn't ended its embargo against Cuba at the very same time, we'd be rid of the butchers named Castro, too. And the Cuban people would be free. What I find so frustrating is that not learning from those mistakes, as we talked about earlier, you have people with a vested interest in perpetuating those mistakes to try to prove themselves right, and it's impossible. You can never go back to Tiananmen Square and justify what that regime did to survive.
Let's go to other parts of the world where you've been very active. Belarus, another one of those countries that just doesn't get spoken about enough. Another brutal dictator, Lukashenko. You've participated in activities. You've protested at their embassy here. You were part of the Blue Jean Revolution, which at the end of the day got you more attention than probably necessary at the time. But it was good for the cause. And at the time, the story was that you had been at the protest at the Belarusian embassy and the part of the Blue Jean Revolution, and then when we're in Congress and still had the blue jeans on and made a statement on behalf of the people. That actually brought tremendous attention to the Blue Jean Revolution in Belarus, which people would not have known about otherwise. Why do you think that the world doesn't pay enough attention to countries like Belarus, countries like, you mentioned Cuba beforehand, Georgia? These are all countries that what a lot of them have in common, and particularly Georgia and Belarus, is that they're under the sphere of Russia. Now, apparently the reset policies of both President Bush and President Obama are not working. What are your views on Russia?
Well, it's Putin's Russia, former KGB member. When you look at what's happened in Belarus, when you look at what's happened in Georgia, when you look at some of the cyber attacks on the Baltic nations that emanate out of Russia, Mr. Putin's been very clear. He talks about how he believes that these nations constitute Russia's near abroad, which is his way of saying they may look like democracies, they may look like sovereign nations, but they will still be ruled as if the Soviet Union's yoke was upon them. He's also gone back and he's looked at history, and he sees what happened to the Soviet Union. And I think that he's not a fan of democracy, and I think if he had his druthers, he'd have the Russian government look much more like what you see in communist China than what you see in Washington, D.C., or in any other free nation. So when we talk about the reset button, especially after what happened to the sovereign democracy of Georgia, especially after Mr. Putin continues to try to, shall we say, gloss over the Stalinist era and rehabilitate him, I think that we should be very concerned about what that nation is going to be up to in the future. One of the things people don't pay much attention to, of course the mainstream media, when I say that is what I mean, is a thing called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is supposed to be an economic, cultural, and diplomatic organization, including communist China and Putin's Russia. Well, they let in an observer nation not too long ago. Do you know who it was?
Cuba, I would imagine, or Belarus.
Iran. Yeah, it's comprised of the communist China, Russia, the stands, and now they have observer status for Iran. As my former colleague Lincoln Diaz-Balart so aptly put it, I'll spare you the gesticulations because we're on radio.
We're on radio.
Yes. He said, you can look at Russia, you can look at China, you can look at Venezuela, you can look at Iran. In the end, there's America and anti-Americanism.
No.
He's right.
And that's
They're
true.
all interrelated.
Poland, the Czech Republic, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova have all been, in recent years, victims, to say, of kind of this move by Putin in order to exert his force and his presence on the region. How concerned were you when President Obama and President Medvedev met recently, got caught on the open mic with President Obama telling him that he'll have more flexibility to deal with, to negotiate with Russia after the elections?
Well, it goes back to the continuing reset myth. That somehow if Russia continues to treat its neighbors as if they're colonies, if someone continues to think that somehow Mr. Putin has a soul, when you look through his eyes, as former President Bush once said, as someone who continues to think that Russia can do what it wants and we're the problem, I think that's fundamentally backwards and a mistake, and it's just going to continue to, in Mr. Putin's mind or Mr. Medvedev's mind, justify their continued expansion of their interests throughout that region despite what their neighbors may or may not want. That is not helpful. We saw this going back to the strategic missile, to the missile shields. Mm-hmm. We've seen this going back even in some ways to the Bush administration, where I don't think there was a very particularly robust, to use a term, response to what happened in Georgia. So to me, it's just a simple question of you don't reset with people who are misbehaving because you just get more bad behavior.
How do you think the administration has handled the Arab Spring?
I think you've always had to look at each individual country and movements within each individual country rather than gloss over it as if it's one unanimous, a question of unanimity amongst what everybody wants. That's a very complicated, complex region. I think there was a horrible mistake made in Egypt the way it was handled. I said so at the time. John Bolton said so at the time. Now we're seeing the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Everything that happened in Iran in 1978, 79, 80 is happening in Egypt. I think that when you look at some of the other nations, you have to be very careful. To me,
what was the failing moment there in Egypt?
To abandon Mubarak before you had a process in place that guaranteed a republic, guaranteed a constitutional electoral process that protected the very kids that were out there with the Twitter revolution. Now you're seeing them start to be dragged back, just as you saw with the broad-based liberal movement in Iran when the Shah was abandoned. What happens is the most tightly organized, ruthless cabal can sometimes fill that vacuum and kill its way into power. That's what happened in Iran. And it's a decided possibility that could happen in Egypt, but certainly whether it's through Pacific means or through military martial means, which you're going to continue to see in Egypt as the rise of Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most extreme element in that country.
Because generally there was a pro-democracy movement in Egypt, but it wasn't organized, and the Muslim Brotherhood was what was organized and took advantage of all of those young people in the Twitter world to basically come in and become the next force to be reckoned with.
And those kids are going to suffer. And I was asked that one time of you. They asked about, well, what do you think about the people of Egypt? I said, I hope they get to be free. And I hope that unlike other, I hope that the majority of Egyptians who want to be free, who want to live in peace and prosperity, have the opportunity. It's not usurped from them. The majority of French were not Jacobins. The majority of Russians were not Bolsheviks. The majority of Iranians were not Khomeiniites. And the majority of Egyptians don't want to go back and start seeing some of the recrudescence of violence that we've seen in the past between that country and Israel or others. But that doesn't mean that an organized minority doesn't.
Carson, we need to take another quick break. When we come back, I want to discuss a couple of other countries there in the Arab Spring, Libya and Syria. And then I want to talk about some of these issues that have been brought about in the recent spat between the foreign policy advisors of Governor Romney and President Obama. We'll be right back on From Washington and Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone. Welcome back to From Washington and Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone, and I'm so pleased to have with us just a tremendous member of Congress, Thad McCotter, from the great state of Michigan, and great author, member of Congress, musician, tremendous rocker with the band Second Amendment. And, that's another thing. I mean, people just underestimate. Rock and roll was one of those great things. Was great phenomenons that had a great deal to do with the end of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. And I think that's something that people haven't written enough about that. There should be a book about just the impact of rock and roll on the end of the Soviet bloc.
Well, actually, I just saw on PBS. I'm a Republican who watches PBS occasionally. Don't drum me out of the core. They had a special about how the Beatles' music influenced what happened in the Soviet Union, about how they had to make bootleg copies from X-rays.
Yeah.
And the fact that young people started to realize that a government that didn't want them to enjoy something like that was a government that they didn't want to enjoy having around very much longer. And even today, I think, forget the individual's name, but he's got a shrine to the Beatles in his apartment, and he talks about how for all those years they helped awaken them to the fact that this government was not allowing them the freedom to pursue their artistic pursuits. And so to me, I think you're right. Music is something that transcends politics. It links human beings. It gives you an intimation, an insight into the human condition. And a government that doesn't want you to see that strikes me as a government that shouldn't be on this earth.
And actually, a lot of the underground music movements and rock groups in Hungary and other Eastern European countries were referred to by politicians because they were the only people that nationally people knew who they were because they had a following from the music. So they were seen almost as a coalescing force around the political movements in opposition to the regime. So never underestimate the power of rock and roll.
There's an irony there. Well, first, we can't talk about Russia without talking about Boris Grebenshchikov, who was just a tremendous talent. He actually put out a couple discs here. But when you talk about it, one of the great ironies of rock and roll is in the United States as it became increasingly commercialized and corporatized, it was actually being a true rebellious force for rebellion throughout the communist bloc.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the other countries in the Arab Spring, although I can talk about rock and roll and its influencing role in the end of the Soviet bloc forever.
It is international.
It is international by far. Libya. Do you think that the president did a better job in Libya than he did in Egypt? Well, the result seems to be a bit different.
Every country's different. I think that when you talk about the cold strategic reality that we had, Gaddafi renouncing his chemical weapons and his pursuit of terrorism, you could say to yourself that that's a situation at least where you have some stability there in terms of the United States' interests. In terms of the revolution that occurred there, the question is this really tribes competing with each other? Is this an overall movement for freedom, or is this an overall movement for position amongst one's fellow country people? I think the jury's out as to what's going to happen in Libya now. I think it's a very difficult situation. There's a lot of poverty in the country. There's a lot of political turmoil in the country that dates back even preceding Gaddafi that hasn't been addressed throughout the decades. It's actually been made worse by that regime. So I think that what the president did, and I supported the policy after it was adopted, the no-fly zone. We have men and women in harm's way. You have to support them accomplishing their mission coming home. I think that he was right to go back into a more support-oriented role as quickly as we could. And I would hope, as I think the president has said, is that the European Union actually steps up to the plate and actually plays a predominant role in trying to help figure out what's going to happen in Libya. But the future of Libya remains in Libyans' hands, and it's much like I think you're going to segue to Syria, where you have to look at the facts on the ground, the different groups and the different long-standing animosities and the long-standing alliances that are going to come into play. And we would like to see the bloodshed and violence end. Now, in this instance, I think it's a case where Russia's being particularly problematical. I don't think Communist China is being particularly helpful. They're letting Putin's Russia take the lead on protecting the Assad regime. And I think that really the force that can help try to put pressure on there to alleviate the bloodshed is the Arab League. You know, in a perfect world, they don't seem to be able to do that. Lastly, I think that it shows the futility of the United Nations is when Mr. Annan starts to talk about how Iran can be a force for stability in Syria, when all Mr. Annan has to do is remember the Green Revolution was crushed by the Iranian regime when it was fighting for its own freedom and fair elections, when Neda Sultan and Taraneh Mousavi were killed for simply wanting the God-given rights that all of us have. So I think that when you look at Syria, it's a very, very complicated mixed bag with no real side to root for at the present time except one: stop the killing.
Recently, the Governor Romney sent a letter to President Obama on a list of foreign policy issues. the president, his foreign policy advisors, responded in regards to what they consider to be President Obama's foreign policy accomplishments. I want to go through a few of these because, and particularly now Iran, because it's something that you just mentioned and because it's probably the most prevalent foreign policy issue of our current time. According to President Obama's foreign policy advisors, they say that Iran is weaker and more isolated today precisely because of actions that President Obama has taken. Through sustained diplomacy, the president forged unprecedented international consensus to pressure Iran, far greater consensus and pressure than the previous Republican administration achieved through its go alone, my way or the highway approach. You wrote recently and put something out which said, to date, the Obama administration's public overtures to the regime, which are dining with the regime in New York, begrudged recognition of Iranian freedom seekers' struggle and suffering, failure to enforce the Monroe Doctrine as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force intensifies its presence in Venezuela, lapsed sanctions deadline, nebulous plans of military options, and tepid support of the Iranian sanctions as all events administration's desire to entreat with Tehran's despots rather than to stop them. I think that pretty much answers it. But
yeah, well, that's a little dated. I mean, the sanctions, obviously,
sure.
The Iran sanctions have come forward. But
they could do more.
Yeah, but look, it wasn't a go-it-alone strategy by President Bush and the Republican administration or the bipartisan Congress at the time. What you have to look at is, again, that type of statement is just very unhelpful in terms of foreign policy being clarified in the United States and imposed by law, as we saw with the sanctions. See, when we cooperate like we did with the Iran Sanctions Act, we can actually get things done. If the president wants to pretend that somehow the United States was the only country concerned about Iran at that period of time and we were going it alone by decrying and talking about the threat that their potential acquisition of a nuclear weapon, I don't know where they get that from. I suggest they hire better staffers. My concern is that the president seems to think that he can talk to this regime, that somehow he can bring them
and they're talking again
to the table. Yeah, it's good.
And supposedly the media says it's being very successful in Istanbul negotiations.
I highly doubt that. Look, the time for the president to start talking tough was when the Green Revolution was out there, when that regime was ready to be imploded by its own people's aspirations for freedom, and all he did was offer a few words that were mealy-mouthed and didn't get the job done, and certainly didn't do what Reagan did for solidarity. To me, it strikes me as looking back in the past, you have to understand one thing that the president doesn't seem to get. The president does know that he's duly elected by a democratic vote in a republic, a constitutional republic, right, where you have to have the consent of the governed to get in office. The president doesn't seem to understand that that's not how the regime in Iran got into power. They got in there by killing people. They stayed in there by killing people in the Green Revolution while the president didn't say much at the time. So to think that somehow you can talk to people who have killed their way to power, they look at you as weak from the very fact that you are strong enough, Mr. President, to get yourself elected with the consent of the governed. As Winston Churchill said about Hitler, he is a gutter snipe. That is what Ahmadinejad is. And if you try to treat him as if he's some kind of misunderstood statesman, you're going to find yourself in very perilous straits.
And actually something Senator Rubio said on the show last week, if you're going to negotiate, you have to have at least the same ends. And definitely Iran does not have the same end goals that the United States has.
Well, they clearly don't have the same end goals. And I would also point out that when you have the EU finally coming around to supporting the United States with strong sanctions, that wasn't President Bush's fault that the EU did not seem to understand the immediacy of the problem that we had at the time. But what a lot of people don't seem to understand is that as long as you have the back door open to Iran, as long as China behind the scenes is helping them out economically through trade or whatever, or military assistance, or as long via other countries, or as long as you have Putin's Russia doing the same, the back door is wide open. All the sanctions you want are not going to bring that regime down to the point where its own people can seize their freedom. So again, it's just like he puts out a statement. Whatever. The reality remains that Iran does not seem to think that it is isolated and weaker than it was before. And if Iran is correct and the president is mistaken, nothing good is going to come of that.
And I urge all our listeners to go to YouTube and go put in Thad McCotter, and you'll see in 2009 a great floor speech that the congressman gave, and I still recall vividly, with the poster of Neda, the young woman in the Green Revolution that was murdered by a sniper on the streets of Tehran. I mean, that was a historic one of those. That was a Tiananmen moment. That was another one of those moments that I think that brought shame to the democratic free world, and that will be remembered in that way. And hopefully, and I don't think so, because you see still the young people out there and the young people with their enormous desire in Iran for something different. But hopefully that will not have given another generation to this brutal regime in Iran.
Let us hope that this wasn't the version of Hungary 56 or the Prague Spring of 68, and then they all had to wait into the late 80s to get their freedom. Let's hope and work toward the day that the Iranian people can get rid of this oppressive regime and can govern themselves with the liberty that we all share.
Somewhat akin to the Iran conversation, another issue that President Obama's advisors mentioned in the letter is that no president since Harry Truman has done more for Israel's security than President Obama. What do you feel about that?
Doesn't matter what I feel about it. I think there's a lot of Israelis that would disagree with that.
And that's a fundamental issue. Regarding Russia, the foreign policy advisors, President Obama's advisors, say that President Obama has successfully worked with the Russians to advance key policy objectives such as securing and eliminating vulnerable nuclear material worldwide and placing severe multilateral sanctions on Iran. So apparently for them, the reset policy has indeed worked.
The reset policy hasn't worked. Look, you're dealing with Putin. This is a man who was a trained KGB agent. He knows what he's doing. You have to look at the results of what the president has done. Russia believes it's established itself. It's near abroad is safe for them to do whatever they wish to in it, to intimidate other free nations. The United States is seen as retreating from Eastern Europe, is retreating from its commitment to missile defense. And I don't know if that was a reset, then the president reset to reverse, and I think that's a mistake.
Congressman, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Western Hemisphere, something that is important to all of us, our backyard, and not enough attention gets paid to it. This is from Washington and Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone. Welcome back to From Washington al Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone, and I'm talking today with our exceptional guest, Congressman Thaddeus McCotter from the great state of Michigan, and we've pretty much discussed half the world, but with one common theme, the freedom agenda, and the importance. At the end of the day, without freedom, without individual rights, without human rights, there is nothing. There's basically, without democracy, everything else is somewhat irrelevant. The Western Hemisphere is something that doesn't get talked about enough. We see that there's an increasing presence, an increasing desire by Hugo Chavez and his allies to attack democratic institutions in the Western Hemisphere. Just today, President Cristina Kirchner in Argentina nationalized a Spanish oil company, Repsol. Frankly, I don't feel bad for Repsol because Repsol has a long history of dealing with every unpalatable regime you can imagine. So you reap what you sow, as they say. Yet, what it does show is this continuing degrading of the rule of law in the so-called ALBA countries, the Chavez-Castro company. Are we not paying enough attention to this?
I think you are.
What?
I think a lot of your listeners obviously are. But I think it's also problematical because these are very...
Do you hear about this in Congress?
We do in the committee process, obviously. But look, we're in a country in a stagnant economy, a recession that does not seem to end. And so people are rightly worried about the hearth of home. And they do care about this, and they do pay attention. But to go back to your point about what's happening, all these redistributionist moves by these governments are going to do is further, in the long run, impoverish their own citizens. The more you degrade and debase the rule of law, the more you degrade and debase entrepreneurship in industry, industriousness within a country, the more impoverished you're going to be. You can't simply take it over and say, okay, now we're just going to take the money from the private company and start redistributing the wealth, because you're not going to maximize the opportunities that are there for your own people within the private sector. It's non-sustainable. I guess they learned nothing from Greece. I guess they've learned nothing from our own massive debts and deficits. I guess they learned nothing from the Athenian city-state, which went under centuries ago for the very same reasons. So to me, it's a government that's policies are failed and outdated, socialism or socialistic, from the 20th century that aren't sustainable in an entrepreneurial, innovative, globalized 21st century. And these governments that cling to that ideology are going to do everything they can to try to prop up themselves and their big governments, or in some instances, their oppressive governments, but it will not last. The question is, within the interstice between getting rid of these antiquated models of governance and adapting to the 21st century, is how much human suffering will occur because of such bad decisions.
What do you think will have a bigger effect on the Western Hemisphere? This is a question I asked just about to all our guests. The end of the Chavez reign or the end of the Castro reign?
I think it's symbiotic at this point. I think one goes, the other goes right after.
I'm going to stop asking the question because everybody gives me the same answer. But it's
well,
true.
I think
it's true.
yes.
No, but you're right. I mean, I think it shows it's right.
It goes back to Lincoln Diaz-Balart's point. They're all working together. And just as the communist Chinese regimes we talked about understood in the late 80s that the fall of the Soviet Union meant a death sentence for them, unless they killed their own citizens to try to hang on, I think Chavez and the Castro butchers understand that if the thug in Venezuela is gone, the Castro brothers are doomed. I think if he understands if the thugs in Havana are gone, that the thug Chavez is doomed. And I think you'll start to see more people realize that. And I would advocate putting pressure on both so that their own people can seize their freedom.
This weekend was the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia. President Obama was down in Cartagena himself. Secretary Clinton was down there also herself. I don't know if you saw the pictures of her. We have a TV here in the studio, and they're actually showing as we speak pictures of Secretary Clinton partying at Club Havana, is the name of the club, in Cartagena, having an Águila Colombian beer. That's obviously gotten a lot of headlines. One of the things that the President Obama said during the time, one of the big debates was obviously the President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, and others were really pushing for Cuba to be included in the summit process. But Cuba is obviously not a democracy, and not only the Inter-American Democratic Charter, but the Quebec Statement after one of the summits prevents dictatorships from being part of the summit, yet that didn't stop the rest of the hemisphere from wanting to, with the exception of the United States and Canada. And actually, President Obama had a very good quote, and fair is fair, I have to say. He said, "I'm not someone who brings to the table here a lot of baggage from the past, and I want to look at these issues in a new and fresh way. I'm sometimes puzzled by the degree to which countries that themselves have undergone enormous transformations, that have known the oppression of dictatorships, or have found themselves on the wrong side of the ruling elite and have suffered for it. Why would they ignore that same principle here?" I agree with him 100%. The policies, I'm not sure, are completely there, but it's definitely sound rationale.
Well, first on Secretary Clinton, I don't know why it's headlines that she's a human being and actually engages in letting off steam. I think that's fine. I think they shouldn't make such a big deal out of it. Secondly, I agree with the president and Canada's decision to keep Cuba out as a dictatorship. My concern in the long term, though, is what does he mean by "I don't bring the baggage of the past"? As if that's something that can be optionally left behind. The past is the past, and if you look at it truthfully, the baggage that he's talking about is what? An opposition to the Castro regime, killing its own citizens, imprisoning its own citizens, bankrupting the country, exporting every type of mischief that you can possibly think of in the international realm that's against American interests. So to me, that's not baggage. That's called history. It's called truth, and it must inform the prism through which you view your next policies.
As much as I give him credit for this comment, I do have this criticism, and it's what baggage for them means. And baggage for the president means, because he not only says it in regards to Latin America, he says it in regards to South Asia and the Middle East, that it's kind of the blame America policy, that everything is somehow historically our fault because of American policies of expansionism and quote-unquote imperialism in Latin America. That's what's now caused this anti-American strain. So basically their policy is, how do we make the United States popular again in Latin America and in these other regions? And I think that's very counterproductive.
Well, I can't go that far based upon the statement, but I think we can agree that he's yet to really clearly define what he means by baggage. But again, that's up to him. When you talk about baggage, again, history is history. And you can't just simply leave it at the door and pretend that it never happened, such as happens with the forgetting of what happened to the sovereign nation of Georgia at the hands of Putin and the Russians when you decide that you're not going to have baggage of the truthful past and just reset. In many ways, what the president seems to mistake is the difference between being popular and being respected. As commander-in-chief, as the leader of the executive branch, as the leader of the free world, the president had better seek first to be respected. Because if you're not, and you are just simply popular, you'll find out how ephemeral that is in a very, very dangerous world.
I've now heard the president's Latin America advisors on more than one occasion measure their success of their hemispheric policies based on the fact that public opinion polls in Latin America seem to view the president better than they did President Bush before. And I think that's a very dangerous measuring stick.
Well, I think they should view their success by how America's strategic interests are being protected, those of our allies as well. I think they should look at the interests of the country rather than the individual president. And the very fact that they would politicize him to that degree shows that there's a problem there.
Congressman, I can't thank you enough for having been with us today. It's been a great pleasure. Before I let you go, though, I do have one major question that I want to ask, and I want to go back to what we started with because I think this is really important in regards to China. Is it too late to change our China policy?
No. It's never too late to change a bad policy into a good one and go towards a constructive containment policy. And that would be based upon respect rather than popularity or, in our case, being someone who has to importune them to buy our debt. So to me, it's never too late for free people to do the right thing and help expand liberty through peaceful diplomatic means.
You've actually made China an issue, and actually Governor Romney has actually been one of the few presidential candidates in the recent history that has mentioned it along with yourself. How do you think the American people are viewing the China issue?
They understand that economically communist China is a predatory nation. Their unfair practices, their cyber spying, their reverse engineering, counterfeiting, dumping, they get that. They also understand that a communist regime that is busy building up its ability to have mobile nuclear weapons and a deep blue water navy and expand its interests throughout other continents poses a problem. So the American people are very wise.
Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a great pleasure. You always have an audience, and you have an open show here, and it's been our great pleasure. And I hope you do come back, and we'll even play some of your tunes.
Wonderful.
Good. Congressman Thad McCotter, thank you all so much for listening. This has been From Washington and Mundo. I'm your host, Mauricio Claver-Carone, and we'll be back this week, Wednesday.
From Washington al Mundo es una